When people look at the current oil crisis, many see only one thing: the price of oil. They notice prices climbing and assume the situation is serious but manageable. After all, the world has survived energy shocks before. People remember the spike in 2008. They remember the turmoil of 2022. Financial markets are still functioning, stock indexes remain elevated, and policymakers continue to project confidence. On the surface, everything appears under control. But that appearance may be deeply misleading. Because the greatest threat is not the number displayed on an oil price chart. The real danger lies beneath the surface, inside the physical energy system itself. The disruption affecting the Strait of Hormuz is no longer simply a shipping problem. Oil exports remain constrained, tanker movements have been severely reduced, and major Gulf producers are increasingly struggling to move enough crude out of the region. As a result, refineries throughout Asia are facing mounting pressure. Supplies of diesel and aviation fuel are tightening, fertilizer costs are climbing. And the safeguards that have softened the impact so far are not unlimited. Strategic reserves can help for a period of time. Spare production capacity can help for a period of time. Alternative transport routes can help for a period of time. But none of these measures can permanently replace one of the most important energy corridors on Earth, according to estimates from the Energy Information Administration. Restrictions on flows through the Strait of Hormuz have already forced major Gulf exporters to reduce production significantly because storage facilities are rapidly reaching capacity. That distinction is critical. This is no longer merely a story about delayed shipments. It is becoming a story about oil that is not being produced at all. When crude cannot leave a country, it begins accumulating in storage facilities. Eventually, those facilities become full. Once that happens, producers have little choice but to reduce output. And that is where the situation becomes much more serious. Energy experts have repeatedly warned that shutting down oil production creates problems that can persist long after a disruption ends. Many people assume oil wells can simply be turned off and back on again whenever necessary. Reality is far more complicated. When a well is shut down and later restarted, production often fails to return to previous levels. Efficiency can decline, water intrusion can increase. Reservoir pressure can change. In some cases, permanent damage can occur. This means that even if shipping routes reopen tomorrow, supply may not immediately return to normal. The effects can linger long after the crisis itself has ended. And this challenge is not limited to one country. Across the Gulf region, producers are facing the same fundamental problem: limited storage capacity, forced production reductions, and growing technical risks associated with prolonged shutdowns. Iran provides one of the clearest examples. Analysts have warned that storage capacity inside the country could be exhausted surprisingly quickly if exports remain restricted. The reason is rooted in the nature of oil production itself. Oil reservoirs operate under immense natural pressures. Crude continuously moves through pipelines and pumping systems toward export terminals. When storage tanks become full, that flow has nowhere to go. Pressure begins moving backward through the system. If the situation becomes severe enough, infrastructure can suffer lasting damage. Wells can become harder to operate. Reservoirs can be contaminated. Some production capacity may never fully recover. And if similar conditions spread across multiple producing nations at the same time, the consequences become far larger than most market participants currently appreciate. Because when millions of barrels per day disappear from the market, temporary solutions begin to look increasingly fragile. This is why the crisis can appear relatively calm while becoming more dangerous underneath. Markets often assume disruptions will eventually be resolved. Governments release reserves, companies reroute cargo. Traders price in a future recovery. But those measures buy time, they do not create new oil. At some point, the physical reality of supply and demand becomes impossible to ignore. And that is where the Strait of Hormuz becomes so important. This narrow waterway is not simply another shipping lane. It is one of the most strategically significant choke points in the global economy. A vast share of the world's energy and industrial materials move through this corridor. When traffic through Hormuz declines, the effects spread far beyond crude oil. The consequences reach transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, electricity generation, aviation, and ultimately the cost of living itself. Oil is embedded in almost every aspect of modern life. Diesel powers supply chains. Jet fuel keeps global travel moving. Fertilizers support food production. Petrochemicals form the foundation of countless products. Shipping depends on fuel. Agriculture depends on fuel. Industry depends on fuel. When energy supplies become unstable, pressure begins spreading throughout the economy. Initially, the effects appear in wholesale markets, then businesses face higher costs. Eventually, households feel the impact through rising prices and reduced purchasing power. And oil is only part of the story. A significant share of global sulfur trade passes through Hormuz. So do major volumes of liquefied petroleum gas, liquefied natural gas, refined fuels, fertilizers, industrial chemicals, and aluminum. These materials are essential building blocks of the modern economy. Sulfur plays a vital role in fertilizer production. Natural gas supports electricity generation and heating. Refined fuels keep transportation systems functioning. Industrial chemicals support manufacturing. Aluminum is used throughout construction, packaging, transportation, and infrastructure. When access to these commodities becomes restricted, inflationary pressure spreads into sectors that appear completely unrelated to oil. Farmers face higher fertilizer costs. Airlines face higher fuel expenses. Manufacturers encounter rising input costs. Consumers ultimately pay more for goods and services. And all of this can occur before oil prices fully reflect the underlying damage. This is where market expectations become extremely important. Investors continue to assume that the disruption will eventually ease. That belief has repeatedly helped keep prices lower than physical conditions might otherwise justify. But markets are driven not only by current events. They are driven by expectations about the future. If confidence in a rapid resolution begins to fade, pricing can adjust with remarkable speed. And the longer the disruption continues, the fewer protective buffers remain. Before the conflict intensified, thousands of vessels passed through the Strait of Hormuz every month. The route carried roughly 1/5 of global oil trade. Since then, traffic has collapsed dramatically. This is not a minor interruption. It represents a fundamental breakdown in one of the world's most important commercial arteries. And rebuilding confidence takes time. Even after a route technically reopens, ship operators must believe it is safe. Insurers must be willing to provide coverage. Crews must be willing to sail. Buyers and sellers must regain confidence in the route. Political uncertainty, military risks, inspections, and security concerns can all delay a return to normal operations. Reopening a choke point is rarely as simple as removing a barrier. The longer a disruption lasts, the more complicated recovery becomes. This is where the situation evolves from an economic inconvenience into a potentially serious global problem. The world can absorb shocks for a limited period. Inventories can be drawn down, emergency reserves can be released. Alternative suppliers can fill part of the gap. But eventually those buffers begin to disappear. At that stage, the conversation shifts away from higher prices and toward actual shortages. And shortages are far more difficult to manage. Governments can subsidize expensive fuel, they can reduce taxes, they can provide financial support, but they cannot subsidize fuel that does not exist. If physical supply becomes insufficient, demand must fall. That can mean reduced industrial activity, fewer flights, slower transportation networks, and in extreme cases, rationing. One of the clearest warning signs is diesel. While gasoline prices affect consumers directly, diesel influences nearly every part of the economy. Freight transport relies on diesel. Agriculture relies on diesel. Construction relies on diesel. Emergency systems rely on diesel. When diesel becomes scarce or expensive, the impact spreads rapidly through supply chains. Jet fuel presents another vulnerability. If refineries face crude shortages or process less suitable feedstock, aviation fuel supplies can tighten. The result can be higher ticket prices, reduced capacity, and potentially cancelled flights. This is why some analysts argue that focusing solely on crude oil prices misses the broader picture. the greatest strain may emerge elsewhere. In refined fuels, in transportation costs, in shipping insurance, in logistics networks, and throughout global supply chains, major financial institutions have warned that if Gulf exports remain constrained for longer than expected, oil prices could climb substantially higher. But the larger issue is not the price itself. It is what rising prices reveal about the physical balance of supply. Markets can conceal stress for a time, inventories can create the illusion of stability. But once storage fills and production declines, the crisis enters an entirely different phase. It stops being a transportation problem, it becomes a supply problem, and supply problems are much harder to solve. That is why this crisis may already be more severe than it appears. The headline oil price tells only part of the story. Behind the scenes, shipping remains disrupted. Storage capacity is under pressure, production is being curtailed. Refined fuel markets are tightening, and critical supply chains are becoming increasingly vulnerable. If normal operations through the Strait of Hormuz are not restored soon, the effects could extend far beyond energy markets. They could influence food prices, transportation costs, inflation, public finances, and economic growth around the world, because this is not merely an oil story. It is a reminder of how dependent the global economy remains on a handful of critical choke points and how fragile that system can become when one of them is disrupted.